So, in line with the science fiction comic book artwork in these videos, the slow process and drawing each page and making sure the detail is appropriate, I'm going to go through and read from the various short stories I have in process. It's part of an editing process that I've developed to work out details in a story that I wouldn't catch just reading it. There's something about hearing a sentence makes it sound natural or not. You catch things that wouldn't appear just from reading it, because the eyes scan over something and it just doesn't catch it. But you spend a little bit more time looking at the words and looking at the sentences as you're reading it out loud, when you catch things that you wouldn't normally catch. So this is a short story that's in the process of being finished. It's called The Carriers. The rules of burden. Their first rule is, one man's luck is another man's misfortune. The lucky ones had the plastic bottles. They were lighter and didn't crack or break if they were struck hard. The safeguards preventing glass bottles from shattering were available, but were limited to certain circumstances and were no guarantee. Scraps of cloth and leather were sewn together into covers and protective sheaths. They were effective where thread and needle were available. Thread that could be salvaged, often rotten and prone to breaking. Manufactured needles were long since a thing of the past, leaving one to find slivers of metal to make a likeness of a needle, just enough to create a cover for the glass bottles. The plastic bottles turned ugly and gray from repeated use, the clear plastic growing translucent from the gouges and scratches. Some plastic turned yellow over time. Tinted plastic eventually became contaminated, where sunlight couldn't irradiate hidden bacteria. Pollution from stale and stagnant water was a regular concern. The plastic was repairable when punctured, the bottles receptive to a variety of adhesives and epoxies. Still, as with needle and thread, glues and epoxies were difficult to acquire. Ancient tubes and bottles of adhesive were found in piles of trash buried in the ground, in and around the toxic grounds west of the compound, the far wastes and the click farm. These antiques were hardly worth the effort to uncover. The second rule of burden is that all human beings are better under a burden. Mr. Jake had 7 2-liter bottles strapped to his back. Filled from the great well, the water coming up from deep in the ground was still cool and refreshing. Over the course of the day, the sun heated the water as much as it weighed down on Mr. Jake's shoulders, exhausting him to the point of collapse. By the time he returned to the great well to confirm with the wellmaster his delivery to the processing plant, there was nothing left of his endurance but to crawl into his cot. Every morning, waking under the dreary darkness of the catacombs of the compound, Mr. Jake found the rising progress through the halls and corridors to the surface a great awakening for the day. To see the sun, the cloud-free sky, there was inspiration out of the endless depth of the expanse stretched far overhead. Among his peers, the other water carriers, Mr. Jake was a peculiar outlier, an eccentric in that he longed for the morning as much as his chapped lips longed for a drink of water from the great well. No one was permitted to drink from the great well, but a handful of officials and the wellmaster. There were various pipes and faucets scattered within the catacombs for all to drink from, but there was a mild malignancy in the water mixed with the taste of iron. In fact, the wellmaster was so accustomed to drinking from the great well that as little as a sip from any other water source made him horrifically sick. Mr. Olden, who slept in the bunk to Mr. Jake's right, had 4 glass bottles. The bottles were carefully wrapped in sleeves of faded cotton and burlap patchwork, inherited from his father. This very fact that Mr. Olden had a father made him above and beyond most of the other water carriers in the complex. For him to have sleeves to protect his glass bottles, in fact, the very same bottles his father carried, made him doubly fortunate. Even with the protection, the bottles clattered against each other as Mr. Olden carried them over his back. The sleeves added little to the weight, and prevented the bottles from unwanted shattering. The sleeves gave slight cushion as the filled water bottles pressed into Mr. Olden's back, but isolated the refreshing chill from the fresh water pumped from the great well. And yet, the water Mr. Olden offered to the processing plant was cold and refreshing, and was the most preferred of the water offered. There was some talk among the ranks of the compound that, when the current well-master retires, Mr. Olden would be a prime replacement. Having 3 fewer bottles of the same volume than Mr. Jake meant little to Mr. Olden, as the burden he carried was comparable. Mr. Jake and Mr. Olden were of comparable age and build, and of comparable health, and also were as exhausted upon returning to their bunk after a long travel to the processing plant. The third rule of burden is that all human beings require some rest. The heart was involuntary, as were the lungs. The heart was key to the life of a man. The lungs were key to the heart. Without question, without complaint, without choice to do otherwise, the heart and lungs work for the life of the body. The body as a whole should be as involuntary as the constituent parts of the body. As the body of a man is an organ of the body of society, that organ should work with the same involuntary compliance with the life of the larger body. Still, between the heartbeats and between breaths, the organs take rest. A man may have no more or no less rest than the rest the heart and lungs take. A man may have no more or no less rest than any other man. Yet, the human being was weaker than the organs contained within his body, and weaker still than the society of which he was an organ. A man needed more rest than the sleep he took. Mr. Jake sat on his bunk, his hands shaking. It had been a particularly rough day. The path to the processing plant suffered a rock slide, blocking a narrow cut through the deep gorge. There were no injuries, the rock slide happening just as 3 men climbed out of the gorge and before 3 men walked into the gorge. The blocked gorge meant the bypass through the Red Hills was sealed. Today had been Mr. Jake's first day climbing both sides of the Red Hills in a number of months, and silently dreaded the next morning if only because of those hills. The Red Hills were sandy and slippery and had few places to wedge one's feet into for support. It was easy for someone to slip and tumble down the hard clay gradient, to crash at the foot of the hill with a broken foot or arm or leg. His feet always hurt. His legs always hurt. The pain of effort had become integrated into existence, where one didn't notice the pain in spite of the effort. The Red Hills changed that. Twice he slipped, and the effort to catch himself brought on a cramp in his leg. As the heat of the sun pressed into his back, he walked the pain off. The rough-cut leather of his sandals pressed to the soles of his feet, conforming to the calloused curves of his heels and toes. His feet were chilled, the cold from the cavern floor crawling up his ankles through that thin leather, giving his body a dull ache. The concrete floors of the catacombs were maintained at a constant temperature from the depths of the earth. The concrete was from the original construction, the remnants of an ancient ruin. The texture of hard-packed mud formed the floors of areas beyond the original complex, compressed and smoothed from years of wear. Where people congregated, curvatures and irregularities were formed like cow paths in the field, away from the mechanical flatness of the concrete retained in distant corners and under fixed furniture. The walls were brick, with bits of broken concrete and wood where the brick walls had been altered or damaged. There was no memory of what the compound had been in the past, settled deep down into the earth as if the innovators of the catacombs sought some protection under the layers of ground. The halls and chambers were made in a grid pattern, a deliberate construction of rational engineering rather than the random chambers of natural subterranean caverns or of animal excavations. Jake was born and raised within these catacombs. He knew every crack in the walls, every grain of sand in the corners, every shadow, the breadth of the complex from the concrete walls at the entrance to the natural caverns at the furthest corner. He knew nothing more than what he saw, nothing of the history he was told while as a child, the scant details of a great villain who burned the world. Only the righteous and saved were absolved of this burning by hiding in these man-made chambers. Mr. Jake slept with his fellow water carriers in a large chamber with a high ceiling held up by old wood beams and steel girders. The girders were supported at the ends from stacks of rough-cut stones and old concrete, the welds and rivets in the steel beams having succumbed to age and stress. If the roof collapsed onto the heads of every man here, that was acceptable. It was a lesser rule of burden, left unnumbered in the hierarchy of all the rules of burden. A man accepts what happens to him, as it is already written and already done.